Okay, folks, as you probably know if you listen to Formosa Files, we don't usually talk about current events, but this Saturday, May 18th, 20 lawmakers from two opposition parties are going to go to Taiping Island. They're going to go there to observe Coast Guard drills and inspect a newly constructed pier. So, what is Taiping Island? Where is Taiping Island? And how does it connect to Taiwan? So we thought we'd do a little far-flung island episode. Enjoy.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
Today we're looking at some far-flung corners of Kaohsiung City. Heading southwest from the port of Kaohsiung, the first of these faraway ROC islands is Paracels Island. I know it more as Dongsha Island. I think the characters there would be East Sand. It's about 450 kilometers away.
450 kilometers away. That's a fair distance.
Yeah, well, relatively close compared to Taiwan's furthest territory. Keep sailing south for a couple of days and we come to the island of Taiping, also known as Itu Aba.
That's really far away. Yeah, Taiping Island is something like 1,600 kilometers from where we're recording this podcast in Kaohsiung.
Yes. Taiping Island is the largest of the naturally formed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. And yes, it's actually a part of Kaohsiung. So if you were down there and you had a house, which you can't, but anyway, if you did and you had an address on your house, it would be Kaohsiung City, Qijing District, blah, 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 blah. It's a part of Qijing District officially, which is, Qijing Island, that long, narrow island across the harbor from the Kaohsiung waterfront. Only 1,600 kilometers away.
Now, Taiping Island being the largest island in the Spratlys doesn't necessarily mean it's large.
Right. It's big enough for a runway for planes, but not much more. It's the elongated shape of a bread roll, 1.4 kilometers in length, 400 meters in width. Not sure about elevation, but an average of a few meters, probably. It's one of those low-lying coral islands. Most of the islands or islets are uninhabited, as they are really just reefs, rocks, sometimes just visible at low tide.
Or they're shoals.
Yeah, define shoals.
Sandbanks and shallow water. And again, these are uninhabited.
But Taiping Island, being bigger, has an actual population, around 200 military and coast guards, and some support staff.
This Taiping Island is claimed by China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, which actually makes more sense, especially for the last two, Vietnam and the Philippines, considering they are next to the South China Sea.
Careful, John. Very sensitive subject. You have just offended the feelings of 1 billion Chinese people.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject too. Having these multiple claimants for all these islands complicates things. All these different countries claiming islands means there are different versions of histories.
And multiple names in different languages.
Right, and the South China Sea is a huge area.
And in all the various island groups, there are a huge number of reefs and islets. So we could bore people to death with all the names for them and all the name changes through time. But we'll take things easy and try not to maroon any of our listeners.
Maroon, oh.
You know I like puns. Okay, to recap. The Republic of China, that is Taiwan, controls two island territories in the South China Sea. Pratas Island, which lies 450 kilometers southwest of Kaohsiung, and Taiping Island, about 1,600 kilometers away. And the latter, Taiping Island, is in the hotly contested Spratly Islands, where China often makes headlines for building things on these islets, reclaiming land, turning them into larger artificial islands, and then building military facilities. Also doing all of this after promising not to do it.
Yes. Taiwan controls two islands and has claims, on paper at least, on some other islands, such as in the Paracels Island group, which is in between the two islands we mentioned.
So to keep things simple, let's look at all these South China Sea islands as a whole. They share a location in one of the great maritime trade routes in history, connecting East Asia with India and the rest of the Eurasian continent.
And today it's still a lifeblood for trade and energy resources for Japan, South Korea, China, and other countries.
Yeah. Basically, the waters between Vietnam and the Philippines has seen for many, many centuries ships sailing past them, and yet they were largely ignored. So, coral reefs are dangerous, and these are no island havens with inviting food and water resources. Now and then, a ship might explore them, maybe mark them down in a chart, but in general, they were best avoided.
Yes, they were visited sometimes by Chinese fishermen who set up temporary camps, but yes, basically ignored, a very light footprint through the centuries. However, because in more recent times, as they've been claimed by various countries, there has been a scramble to find some old claims to sovereignty. This has resulted in some very poor history. The story of the South China Sea Islands only really begins about 120 years ago, and it starts with guano.
Guano, a Spanish word, guano, basically fertilizer in the form of seabird droppings, dry bird droppings, accumulating on rocky offshore islands, and there's like meters of the stuff.
Guano is full of important nutrients for plants, packed with potassium, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. It would, in time, be replaced by industrially made fertilizer, but in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was an incredibly important resource.
Guano, fertilizer from seabird droppings. One of the great resources of the 19th and 20th centuries, okay.
Yes, 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 and very much a forgotten story, and an especially important one for the Pacific Ocean.
John, you're getting quite excited about excrement.
Yes, because it's part of such a huge story. If we go back a century or more, there were great concerns about population and famine. The world was heading towards a disaster of overpopulation. How could nations feed their growing populations?
A population time bomb.
Yeah, a population time bomb was coming. Many thought farming advances could not match population advances. There would be scarcity and there would be war. Farming was in trouble. Soils depleted, worn out. New territory was needed and also fertilizer to raise productivity. People seem not to realize how input intensive agriculture is. Even new land is soon exhausted. My native country of New Zealand, its agricultural industry was built on guano fertilizer. The natural fertility of soils is very soon depleted. And a century ago, the Japanese were desperate to feed their rapidly growing population.
One of the solutions for the Japanese was having the population move overseas, whether as immigrants or as colonists in newly acquired territory.
Yep. And either prospect scared the heck out of white nations around the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific states of the US. They were worried about an expansionist Japan, and you can see it in books written at the time, such as ones with the title Must We Fight Japan, published in 1921.
A book called Must We Fight Japan, published in 1921. That's interesting because that comes way before the ultra militaristic Japan of the 1930s.
Right. So it's more a question of population and food.
So these tiny islands in the South China Sea, these pieces of rock in the sea, had a lot of guano, which meant fertilizer for growing populations. And there was also a secondary benefit. These outposts had potential strategic value for an expanding Japanese empire.
Yes, and so we see Japanese guano mining operations moving into the South China Sea. And they're operating out of your hometown.
The southern Taiwan port city of Kaohsiung. So there's guano mining in the South China Seas before the modern day nations made any formal claims on these islands.
Correct. Before the Japanese, there was actually a failed attempt by an Anglo American consortium. They were looking to mine guano in the Spratly Islands.
So the Spratly Islands, that's where Taiping Island is located. It's part of that Spratly Island group, and it's about 1,600 kilometers southwest of Taiwan.
Yes.
Okay, so you find some likely looking islands you want to mine. Who do you ask for permission?
Okay, this case was back in 1877, and the head of the Anglo-American grouper, Mr. Graham, he figured he should ask the British. He submitted a claim to the British colonial authorities in a tiny island colony settlement called Labuan in Borneo. You look confused. Don't worry, I've never heard of this tiny little British settlement either.
Okay, so the officials there, I'm going to guess, had no idea what to do.
Correct. Why come here and ask us, they thought. So they forwarded the request up the bureaucratic food chain, eventually getting to the Foreign Office in London, where the request gets kicked around between various offices. 2 years later, Graham got tired of waiting and just started mining.
Not a bad approach when dealing with bureaucracy. Just start.
Just start, right. And that's provided you keep things quiet.
But this was not the case with this Mr. Graham.
You're right. Graham hired 30 Chinese laborers from Hong Kong, but just a matter of weeks later, some of the laborers wanted to go home. Homesick and hungry they were. Graham said, no, stick to your contract. And then there were arguments over food rations. I guess they got tired of eating seabirds. Anyway, this information I've got on this is from an excellent book, Japan's Ocean Borderlands by Paul Crateman. He says things ended with Graham's English assistant, shooting 2 miners dead, and then there was the attempted murder of the Englishman.
Very dramatic, but not a great start to the guano extraction industry in the South Seas. And for the next 3 decades, the fertilizer treasure pretty much lay there undisturbed. So, 1907, Taiwan's a Japanese territory, and Japan's got an eye on expansion further south. We see in 1907 a Japanese man by the name of Nishizawa Yoshiji looking to mine guano in the Pratas Islands. So the Pratas Islands are the island or islands about 450 kilometers from Kaohsiung, one of the 2 currently controlled by Taiwan.
This Nishizawa fellow made inquiries at the Japanese consulate in Hong Kong.
Who owns them? He asks. The islands are closest to Chinese territory, but the Japanese consular officials tell Nishizawa, as far as we know, nobody owns them. Not the Chinese, not the British.
So this Japanese guy formally asked the Japanese government to annex the islands to Taiwan. Annex, in other words, seize them.
The Japanese Foreign Ministry wasn't, anti-annexation. They didn't dismiss the idea out of hand, but they thought they might get some pushback from Britain, which also likes to annex things. However, why it's the business of the British, I don't know.
Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Think of them as the world's policemen or the world's coast guard.
Okay. So the Japanese Foreign Ministry tells Nishizawa something like, don't worry about the paperwork, just start mining guano on the islands, and by being there, you'll strengthen the case for sovereignty over the islands, and also, by the way, try not to shoot any of your workers.
You invented that last bit, didn't you?
Yeah, well, it seems like a good bit of advice. So things seem to have gone well enough. Nishizawa invested quite a lot. There were piers, for ships, dormitories for laborers, and even telephone cables laid.
Then, 2 years later, 1909, the news that there was mining on the Pratas Islands created an outcry in China. I wonder if the Americans in the Philippines had passed on that information. They were worried about Japanese territorial ambitions. But it could have been Chinese fishermen too. Anyway, the Chinese government, in its last days of the Qing Empire, they wanted to make a big deal about it, which kind of surprised everyone. They had plenty of other things to be worried and upset about.
Definitely. And, the Chinese claim to these islands is pretty weak.
Yes, but the Japanese government decided not to risk the issue blowing up and turning into a boycott of Japanese goods.
In an unusual example of cooperation between the Chinese and Japanese, a settlement was reached. Nishizawa agreed to leave, compensated with 130,000 silver dollars paid by the Guangdong government.
Quoting from an excellent book here, The South China Sea by Bill Hayton, quote, the Cantonese, Guangdong, the Cantonese authorities hope to recoup the money by adopting Mr. Nishizawa's business plan. They even hired a couple of his guano mining experts to advise them. Sadly, it all came to nothing. Without a wharf to load large ships, the whole project was uneconomic. By Christmas 1910, it had been abandoned, and Pratas was reported to be deserted again.
Fast forward to 1920, moved down to those Paracel Islands, and there was another Japanese businessman looking to mine guano.
Perhaps a reminder for people about that island group.
Yeah, we've discussed Pratas Island, 450 kilometers from Kaohsiung, and Taiping Island in the Spratly Island group, 1,600 kilometers from Kaohsiung. These Paracel Islands are in between, roughly 1,000 kilometers from the port of Kaohsiung.
Thanks for that rather Kaohsiung-centric explanation.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, so this Japanese businessman, Hirata Suharu, was based in Kaohsiung, actually, and he was following the, act first, get permission later business model.
Mm-hmm. When the Japanese authorities found out, they told him to stop and get permission from the Chinese. By partnering with a Chinese merchant, he was able to proceed.
Okay, so I'm not quite getting. The Chinese have a strong claim to the Paracels?
Well, as good as anyone's. But in that book, Japan's Ocean Borderlands, written by Paul Craitman, he says they didn't have that much of a claim. He cites the following story, quote, in 1895, for instance, the Guangdong government had shrugged off a British insurance company's attempt to claim compensation for a shipwreck that had been looted by Hainanese fishermen. That's the Chinese island of Hainan. Okay, so a shipwreck that had been looted by Hainanese fishermen, quote, on the grounds that for them, the Paracels were abandoned islands that belonged no more to China than to Annam, Vietnam, and that, quote, no special authority was responsible for policing them, quote.
Yeah.
End quote.
Okay, so since then, the Chinese government has changed its mind, thinking about, I don't know, national dignity perhaps, but definitely also some potential profits.
The mining venture suffered from a lot of internal Chinese politics, but it kept running until the end of the decade. And yeah, the workers there were not Chinese, they were Japanese and Taiwanese.
When we enter the 1930s, Japan is more militaristic. In 1931, they invaded northeast China and set up the Japanese-run puppet state, Manchukuo. The South China Sea Islands have greater strategic value as war looms, but guano is no longer the key product it was.
Not so fast. Let's go back a decade and head down from the Paracel Islands to the Spratly Islands for another guano mining story.
Okay, just to remember the Spratly Islands, that's where Taiping Island, the biggest one there is, 1,600 kilometers from Kaohsiung, and Taiwan's southernmost territory.
Yes, in 1921, the Japanese established a small mining operation there.
And when we say the Japanese, we're simplifying things. There was not one Japanese authority. There were, of course, different branches of the government and the military, different groups here and private interests, and not all these people were necessarily on the same page.
Very good point. The foreign ministry is behind this guano operation, but the naval ministry, the Navy, is looking for another more permanent settlement because these guano operations are very subject to price changes. The Navy wants to get into fishing.
Yeah, I guess like me, they've had enough of bird excrement.
The Navy working with the authorities in Japan provide the funding for a fishing base on Taiping Island.
Government money behind a civilian face.
Yes. Paul Craitman writes that the fisheries operation in the Spratlys, quote, provided the perfect cover for installing infrastructure necessary for, quote unquote, national defense, a wireless station, meteorology equipment, quote unquote, protection against pirates, and most importantly, oil storage tanks, and as a submarine refueling station.
And the front man for this fisheries/military operation was that Kaohsiung-based Japanese merchant we mentioned before, Hirata Suharu, who had been mining guano on the Paracel Islands. He'd lost money on that, but he recovered. And in the 1920s, he'd built up good connections with Japanese naval officers stationed in Taiwan.
He sounds like quite a character. He even made the pages of the New York Times for pushing Japan to annex the Paracels. And this is a nice touch here. He suggested the islands be renamed the Hirata Archipelago.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. So we were mentioning, fighting going on between Japanese branches of government, military, blah, blah, blah. The foreign ministry saw this Navy program as messing with its guano company setup. They saw the military as trying to take control.
Yes. And this fishing operation was also trying to get into the guano mining, pushing out the foreign ministry influence.
Much like bird droppings, history is rather messy. Not just countries fighting over islands, but different interests from the same country.
Indeed, very messy. For example, the Taiwan government was going to give 100,000 yen subsidy to Hirata's company. This is the fishing setup, right? But the foreign ministry intervened and got the finance minister to axe that subsidy.
But then the Japanese Navy says, no problem, we'll give you double that amount.
Right. So money's not the real purpose here. Whether fisheries or guano, the main purpose was staking claims.
And as we enter the 1930s, there is increasing interest in claiming sovereignty over the South China Sea. And there are quite a few actors involved.
Yeah, if we're talking imperial powers in the region, there are the Japanese, their closest presence is in Taiwan. Then the Americans in the Philippines, the French in Indochina, more specifically Vietnam, the British in Hong Kong, Peninsula Malaysia, and northern Borneo, and the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies.
Oh, yeah, wow. But it was actually the French who took action first. France formally claimed the Paracel and Spratly Islands into French Indochina, so Vietnam, in 1932.
China and Japan both protested.
On the 6th of April, 1933, France seized the Spratlys, formally included them into French Indochina.
Yeah, I'm not sure what seize actually entailed. Probably just send in a few warships, let off a few cannon, plant a flag, sail away. In a few places, they built a couple of buildings. They let the Chinese fishermen they found keep fishing.
And in July 1938, French Indochinese, again Vietnamese, colonial troops also formally occupied the Paracel Islands.
But less than a year later, the Japanese make a move. March 1939, Japan took both the Paracel and Spratly Islands from France, garrisoned them, and built a submarine base on Taiping Island. And a couple of years later, they were designated, all these islands were designated as part of Japan's colony of Taiwan.
Yeah, specifically part of Kaohsiung. So, did these strategic islands play a strategic role in World War II? The answer is not really. I read something about a torpedo squadron being stationed at Taiping.
Yeah, that torpedo squadron you mentioned was involved in the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, but they came from Taiwan, not from the further away Spratlys.
So, once again, from Kaohsiung?
Maybe, I don't know. There was a large port at Magong, Penghu, so from either one of these.
At the end of the war, it seems there was no longer any Japanese presence on Taiping Island.
Right, they'd abandoned it.
After World War II, there's a brief lull. None of the Paracel or Spratly Islands were occupied. Then things heated up in 1946 through 1947. France, again, and China this time, both want the islands.
The Republic of China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was looking for an easy display of strength, of showing his anti-imperialistic credentials. I think he should have concentrated on beating the commies.
Good point. And at the same time, the French are trying to reestablish their control of Vietnam, and the top French commander in Vietnam has orders to secure the islands, and they probably should have been worried about other things as well.
Hmm. In late 1946, both nations sent warships to put some muscle behind their claims and island ambitions.
Okay, but that's a story for a future episode. The South China Seas would become an international hotspot.
Yes, but by then the age of guano had passed forever. So, why were so many countries interested in these rocky outcrops?
So, why people want these rocky bits of rock? Potential oil and gas reserves, under perhaps fishery resources, a lot of nationalistic pride, and of course, strategic concerns. Anyway, a reminder if you check our website, we'll put up some maps and other information, help you make more sense of the area that we're talking about.
Eryk, seeing as these islands are in Kaohsiung City, why don't you pop down and get some pictures for us?
Hey, if the RSC military or government is listening and you want to give me a ride down there, I'm happy to go do a live Formosa Files episode on the ground. Not a problem.
Yeah, that would be great.
Would be fun. Yeah, they're beautiful. All right, folks, thanks for listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eryk Michael Smith in Kaohsiung.
I'm John Ross.